My name is Archibald Mason, and I turned 76 last Thursday. I live alone now, in a 2-bedroom brick house in Boulder, Colorado, the same house where my wife Elaine and I raised our only son, Trevor, and grew old together. Since she passed, the house has not shrunk, but my presence inside it has. Like I've slowly evaporated into the walls, reduced to someone who doesn't open more than 2 doors a day. I haven't used the guest bedroom in 6 years. The dining room still has her crystal bowl on the table, filled with potpourri that's long since lost its scent. And every morning I walk past it as if Elaine will suddenly reappear and scold me for not replacing the flowers. When you live with absence for long enough, you start making it part of your routine. I still say good morning out loud when I wake up, and I still say good night when I turn off the light in the bedroom. The silence answers back, every time. I eat the same breakfast each day, 2 pieces of dry toast, half a banana, a cup of tea with milk. And I read the newspaper not because I care much about the news anymore, but because it fills time between waking and remembering. Trevor hasn't lived in this house since 1998. He left for Stanford, then Silicon Valley, and eventually wound up married to Janice Hawthorne, a woman whose family owns 4 properties in Aspen and whose father used to sit on the board of a private bank I couldn't afford to use even if I wanted to. Trevor is now some kind of strategist or solutions architect, which is a job title that doesn't mean anything to me, but apparently pays enough to have a house with 6 bathrooms and 2 Teslas in the garage. I don't drive anymore. Glaucoma. But even when I did, the most extravagant vehicle I ever owned was a rust-red Buick that my wife christened the Ox. After Elaine died, quickly, brutally, 1 stroke, and it was over, I think part of me believed Trevor would come home. Not to live here, no. But I thought maybe he'd show up more than twice a year. Maybe he'd remember that I don't like coffee table conversations, that I'm not just a container for his childhood. I thought grief might bridge the years of silence between us. Instead, it only widened them. Janice is very gracious in a superficial way. She sends updates, usually emails with photos of their golden retriever in matching sweaters with their daughter Olivia, who is 9 now and wouldn't recognize me on the street. They don't call. Well, not unless Trevor needs something. Tax advice, a co-signer, once even a recommendation for a rare book dealer because one of Janice's friends had a wedding with a vintage literature theme, and he remembered I used to teach English. I retired at 70, not by choice. They phased out my position after the school merged with some charter initiative, and the new administrators decided Shakespeare and Steinbeck were not career relevant. They gave me a plaque and a lunch, and then the library cart I'd wheeled between classrooms for 32 years was rolled into a closet and never brought out again. Elaine told me to write a book. She said, "You've read more than most people will in 3 lifetimes. You've taught thousands of students. You should put it down, Archie. Let the words belong to you for once." But I never did. I couldn't bring myself to put anything on the page that didn't begin with a rubric. Now, most days are shaped by weather and medication schedules. I watch birds. I time the mail. I grocery shop at dawn so I don't have to speak to anyone. I try not to think about how the house sounds more alive when I walk into it after a day outside. It means the quiet has been settling while I was gone, like dust. I don't get visitors. My neighbors are younger couples, mostly tech people, and I think they feel guilty when they see me struggling with the recycling bin. They wave. Sometimes they offer to help, but never twice. Trevor's last visit was Christmas. Not this past one, but the one before. He came alone. Janice had holiday migraines, and Olivia had some ski program. Trevor brought a bottle of expensive red wine, said it was organic, biodynamic, low intervention. I opened a cheap Zinfandel and poured him a glass. He didn't drink it. He talked a lot about work. I listened. At one point, I mentioned how Elaine used to knit sweaters for the cold snaps in February, and he nodded like I'd reminded him of a childhood he couldn't quite place. When he left the next morning, he gave me a hug that felt practiced, like a handshake with too many steps. So when my birthday came last week, I didn't expect much. Elaine used to make a fuss, a cake with cream cheese frosting, a walk at Chautauqua, sometimes a surprise dinner with old friends. But those days are behind me. I was expecting maybe a phone call. Instead, a delivery man dropped off a sleek black box tied with a ribbon. No card. Inside was a bottle of Highland Park 18-year-old Viking Pride. A very expensive scotch. Not my favorite. Elaine always said I preferred Irish, but certainly high-end. There was a typed note in small corporate font. "Happy birthday, Dad. Thought you might enjoy this. Trevor." That was it. No love, no see you soon, no mention of dinner or celebration, just a bottle of something he assumed I'd drink alone. Maybe he imagined it was a thoughtful gesture. Maybe he just clicked it into an Amazon cart during a meeting. I held the bottle in my hands for a long time. It was heavy, serious, pretentious. I thought about how little it meant, how much more I would have preferred a 10-minute phone call or a letter in his handwriting. That same day I'd been invited, more accurately informed, about a birthday dinner being thrown for Janice's father, Mr. Hawthorne. He was turning 75, and their family was hosting a formal dinner at a private room in an upscale restaurant downtown. I hadn't been to a restaurant like that in years. I hadn't been invited to anything in years. Janice sent the invitation by email with a note saying, "Trevor thought you might enjoy a nice night out." It wasn't a request. I wore my old navy blue blazer, Elaine's favorite. Still had her perfume faintly embedded in the collar. I debated whether or not to bring the bottle of whiskey. It felt symbolic. And as I watched myself in the mirror, tie slightly askew, liver spots more visible than ever, I realized that maybe that's what I'd become. A man full of symbols no one cared to interpret. So I took the whiskey with me. And that was the beginning of the end. The evening of the birthday dinner arrived with the kind of January cold that makes everything feel sharper than it should be. Even the car door handle burned my fingers when I grabbed it. I wore the same coat I'd had for 20 years, a wool blend with thinning elbows and a frayed lining. Elaine always said it made me look dignified, though now it just looked like something a widower refused to throw away. I shaved, slicked back my remaining hair, polished my shoes, and brought along the bottle of Highland Park Scotch in its black box. I hadn't opened it. I hadn't even taken off the ribbon. I carried it like an obligation, like something I needed to offload in order to make it through the evening. The restaurant was downtown, in one of those modern, dimly lit places where the chairs are deliberately uncomfortable and the menus don't have prices. The kind of place where everyone talks about food in abstract terms. Notes of oak. Hint of bergamot. It was the sort of place Trevor never took me to, but often posted about on his social media feeds. I hadn't been in a room like that since Elaine's retirement party a decade ago, and back then the music had been Sinatra, not this barely there jazz hum that felt like it was piped in from an adjacent universe. When I arrived, the hostess greeted me by name, which meant someone had arranged everything down to the last polite detail. She led me through a winding hallway to a private room in the back. There were about 30 people already there, gathered around a long mahogany table, sipping champagne and nibbling canapes arranged like tiny architecture. Trevor was standing next to Janice, who wore a dress that shimmered like it cost more than my monthly pension. When they saw me, Janice smiled tightly and came forward, but Trevor only raised his glass slightly, as if I were another client from the office. "Dad, you made it," Janice said, kissing the air near my cheek. "You look sharp." I handed her the box. "This is for your father. It's from Trevor." Janice hesitated for a second, then laughed. "How thoughtful," she said, even though she obviously didn't recognize the brand or its value. She turned to pass it off to one of the servers without ceremony. I almost stopped her, wanted to say, "It's an 18-year-old single malt," but then I caught Trevor's eyes, and something in them told me not to embarrass him. So I let the box disappear into the restaurant's machinery, like a package rerouted by a sorting system I didn't understand. Janice's father, Lawrence Hawthorne, stood near the head of the table, surrounded by what looked like a constellation of bankers, developers, and real estate attorneys. He was a tall man, taller than me by a full head, with a face that had aged well. Silver hair, tan skin, expensive dental work. He was laughing too loudly at something someone had said, and when he turned and saw me, his expression flickered for a second. Recognition mixed with something colder. "Ah, Archibald," he said, shaking my hand with a firm, almost punishing grip. "Glad you could join us." "Happy birthday, Lawrence," I said. "You're a year younger than me now." He laughed politely, the kind of laugh that ended the conversation. I was shown to my seat, near the far end of the table, away from the central group. I sat between Janice's cousin, who spent the entire dinner tapping on his smartwatch, and a woman whose name I never caught, but who told me 3 different times about her yoga instructor's affair. The food was microscopic. Each course was announced like a museum piece. "This is a beet reduction over quail egg foam with micro basil," and I chewed everything slowly. Not because it tasted good, but because it gave me something to do with my face. When the main course arrived, Trevor finally acknowledged me more directly. He turned from a conversation with his father-in-law and raised his glass. "To Dad," he said, his voice a little too loud for the moment. "Who's still kicking, 76 years and counting?" There were a few polite claps, a smile or two. Lawrence added, "Let's hope I'm still upright next year, eh, Archibald?" I nodded, felt my ears burn. Janice leaned in then, wine glass in hand, and said something that she thought was affectionate. "We were worried you might not make it tonight. Trevor said you've been having some trouble getting out and about lately?" I blinked. "Who said that?" "Oh, it's nothing," she said quickly. "You know, you get to a certain age and, well, Trevor worries." That was the moment something shifted. It was small, a flick of a sentence, but it stayed with me. Trevor had never said a word about worrying, not in any of the 2-minute phone calls, not in any email. And yet here it was, a narrative being spun in a room of strangers, that I was frail, that I was becoming unreliable, that I was slipping. When the dessert arrived, a sphere of something that cracked under a spoon to reveal a cloud of citrus mousse, Lawrence stood to give a speech. It was long, meandering, full of stories about business ventures and golf victories and a trip to Chile with a woman who may or may not have been his third wife. Everyone laughed, toasts were raised, photos were taken, and when he opened his gifts at the end of the night, he held up the black box with the Highland Park scotch and grinned like a child. "Now this," he said, "this is class." "Thank you, Trevor." Everyone applauded. Trevor smiled and nodded. He did not correct him. He did not say, "Actually, my father brought that." He let the moment pass without friction, like water flowing downhill. I watched him from across the table and really realized, how complete the distance between us had become. He didn't see me as a father anymore. Maybe he hadn't for years. He saw me as an echo of obligation, a necessary footnote in his otherwise streamlined life. On the ride home, I asked the driver to make a detour. I didn't want to go straight back to the house. I didn't want to sit in the kitchen with my cup of tea, staring at the spot where Elaine used to stand when she hummed and fried eggs. I asked to be dropped off at the Chautauqua trailhead. The sky was already dark, the air brittle with frost, and I walked only a few steps before my knees reminded me who I was now. But I stood there, facing the black outline of the Flatirons, and I thought about that bottle of scotch, how easily it had been misattributed, how quickly I had become irrelevant, even in my own gestures. There was a time Trevor would have known that wasn't just a bottle. It was a message, a line between us, offered, even if wordless. But now I wasn't sure if he'd even recognized it as something I might have taken personally. Maybe he had never really known me. Maybe he only remembered the father who graded papers late at night and forgot to cheer loud enough at his baseball games. Maybe that's the version Janice saw, too. The absentee intellectual. The self-important literature teacher who couldn't keep up with a digital world. I walked back to the car slowly. My knees ached. My chest was tight, but not from cold, from something harder to name. And when I got home, I poured myself a glass of Elaine's sherry. Not scotch, not whiskey, just the sweet amber she used to drink after dinner, in her favorite green glass. I sat in the living room in the dark and made a toast to nothing, just silence. The next morning, the first thing I noticed was the voicemail light blinking on the landline I keep in the kitchen. No one calls that number anymore except telemarketers and the pharmacy with automated reminders. But this message was from Janice, her tone unmistakably chirpy, that cultivated brightness people use when they're suppressing something. She said they were hosting a small get-together for Lawrence at their house that evening, something more intimate than the restaurant dinner, just family and a few close friends, and that Trevor really hoped I would come. She added, almost as an afterthought, "We'd love to have you." I didn't call back. I showed up. Their house sits in the western foothills, a 3-level contemporary with floor-to-ceiling windows, all glass and cedar and money. Elaine would have hated it. Too cold, she would have said, too architectural. But it's the kind of place that photographs well, which seems to be more important to people now than whether a house feels lived in. When I rang the doorbell, I half expected the lights to flash blue, or a robot to answer. Instead, Janice appeared, dressed in a cashmere sweater and leggings, holding a wine glass that was already half empty. "Archibald," she said, like a newscaster announcing the weather. "Right on time. Come in." I stepped into the foyer and was immediately greeted by a blast of music, soft jazz, with just enough dissonance to feel expensive, and the faint aroma of citrus candles. Everything gleamed. The marble countertops, the brushed brass fixtures. The air itself felt curated. Trevor came around the corner wearing a tailored shirt and holding a tumbler of something neat. When he saw me, he raised his glass in what could barely be described as a smile. "Glad you made it," he said. And I almost believed him. The living room was filled with people I didn't recognize. Some wore name tags, which made the whole thing feel even more performative. I stood near the fireplace holding a glass of water I hadn't asked for, and watched as Lawrence held court near the kitchen island, retelling the same story from the restaurant about his hiking trip in Chile, but now with added embellishments and louder laughter. When Janice introduced me to a couple from Denver, she said, "This is Trevor's father, Archibald." He taught English back when that was still a thing. They laughed politely, and I smiled like it didn't matter. At some point, Trevor gestured for me to follow him upstairs, saying he wanted to show me his new office. I did as asked, though I already knew it wasn't about the furniture. The office was exactly what you'd expect. Sleek, sterile, filled with books arranged by color instead of content. There was a wall-mounted screen displaying analytics or stock trends, and a decanter set I doubted he ever used. "Everything okay, Dad?" he asked, leaning against the desk. I looked at him, his posture, his face that looked more like mine than he'd ever admit. "Why wouldn't it be?" "You've seemed a little tense lately. At dinner last night, you didn't say much." "There wasn't much to say," I replied. He nodded, took a sip from his glass, then said, "Look, I know things haven't always been perfect between us. I get that. But you're not getting any younger. And I just want to make sure you're, set up for whatever comes next. I stared at him, wondering if he'd rehearsed that line. Whatever comes next. You live alone. You've had some health stuff, nothing serious, I know, but Janice and I have been talking, and we think it might be time to explore some options. Assisted living, somewhere you'd have support, people around, meals taken care of. You wouldn't be alone all the time. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. So that's what this is. It's not what you think, he said quickly. We just want what's best for you. What's best for me, I repeated. And you'd decide that? He looked genuinely frustrated now, like a man who'd practiced patience for 10 minutes too long. You're blowing this out of proportion. No, I said, I don't think I am. I think you're trying to manage me. I'm trying to care for you, he said a little too loud. I didn't answer. I walked back downstairs, past people who barely looked at me, past a framed photo of Olivia on a yacht with Janice's family, past the modern art I didn't understand, and into the kitchen, where Lawrence was laughing at his own joke. He saw me and grinned. Archibald, he said, lifting his glass. That whiskey you brought, phenomenal. I had a taste this morning. Trevor's got great taste. I paused. It was for me, I said. Lawrence raised an eyebrow. Really? Yes, I said. Trevor sent it to me for my birthday. I brought it here instead. There was a silence. Not long, but long enough to change the temperature in the room. Someone cleared their throat. Lawrence chuckled. Well then, thank you. Very generous of you. I didn't smile. I turned and walked to the window, watching the wind stir the tops of the pines. A woman nearby whispered something to her husband. I didn't hear it, but I didn't need to. I was now the elderly father who made scenes. The unpredictable one. The burden. Later, when dinner was served, a buffet of tiny servings that looked like science experiments, I sat alone at the end of the table. Trevor and Janice sat together, laughing with Lawrence. I saw Trevor glance my way once, then look quickly back. Janice didn't look at me at all. After dessert, as people were dispersing, Janice approached. You embarrassed Trevor, she said softly, but with steel in her voice. Good, I said. He needed it. She sighed, shaking her head. You don't understand the pressure he's under, the expectations, the business, the family. I was his family, I said. Before all of this, before the pressure and the performance. She tilted her head. We're just trying to help. No, I said. You're trying to erase me? She didn't deny it. Instead, she said, You should go home now, Archibald. It's been a long day. And it had. But not in the way she meant. When I stepped outside into the night, the cold hit me like an open hand. I stood there for a moment, letting it settle into my bones, wondering when exactly my son had stopped being my son. Not by birth, but by choice, by omission, by silence. And then I got in my car and drove home in the dark. 2 days after the dinner, I received a letter. Not an email or a text message, but an actual letter, delivered in a white envelope with a typed return address from a senior wellness consulting firm in Boulder. At first, I thought it was a piece of mail meant for a neighbor, or some kind of mass advertisement. But when I opened it, I found a personalized assessment packet, complete with my name, age, presumed medical history, and a note that read, In accordance with your family's request, we have outlined a proposed care plan that will ensure safety, dignity, and support in your next stage of life. There were brochures, glossy, pastel-colored, featuring smiling men and women with walkers, activity rooms with watercolor classes, and a small print table of fees that made my throat close. I read it twice. The word facility appeared 6 times. Independence was mentioned once, and only in reference to supervised, structured environments. I didn't call Trevor. I didn't need to. This wasn't an accident. He hadn't mentioned it during our conversation upstairs, but it had already been in motion. The paperwork didn't assemble itself overnight. Someone, likely Janice, had initiated this, possibly weeks ago. What unsettled me most was the certainty with which they assumed my compliance, as if the process had already moved past consent and into logistics. That afternoon, I called my lawyer. Not because I intended to start a legal battle, not yet, but because something in me, something old and private, needed to be acknowledged. Martin Rosen was a former student of mine, now well into his 50s, a sharp, fair man with kind eyes and a habit of quoting Dickinson when stressed. He didn't answer immediately, but he called me back before sunset and said, "Mr. Mason, I thought you retired to poetry. Not legal disputes. What's going on?" We met for coffee the next morning, and I brought the assessment letter with me. I didn't dramatize. I just laid it out. Martin read it, frowned, and asked if I'd signed anything in the past few months. "No," I said. "But Trevor did send over a financial document a while ago. Said it was for emergency access to medical funds. I didn't read it carefully. I trusted him." Martin nodded, made a note in a small leather-bound pad, and asked me to bring him every paper I'd signed in the last year. "It's probably nothing," he said, "but I've seen these things snowball." Afterwards, I sat on a bench outside the coffee shop, watching the college students cross the street with headphones and coffees the size of their heads. One of them looked like Trevor at 19. He even had the same careless walk, the same look of someone whose future was a wide-open road. I felt a sudden sting behind my eyes and had to look away. I used to think that raising a child meant you poured parts of yourself into them, that your voice would echo inside their decisions. But I realized then how easily that echo fades, how silence eventually wins. Back at home, I went through the desk in the study, the one Elaine had used for recipes and tax receipts, and her yearly Christmas letter drafts. I found the envelope Trevor had mailed me last October. Inside was a single page, typed, and a line at the bottom for my signature. It had looked harmless. Authorization for transfer of emergency funds. I'd signed it without reading the fine print. Martin later told me it granted them joint access to one of my investment accounts, limited to health-related expenditures, a clause vague enough to cover almost anything if framed properly. That night, I opened the top drawer of Elaine's nightstand. I hadn't done that in years. Inside was a stack of letters I'd forgotten existed, birthday cards, love notes from our early years, and one sealed envelope addressed in her handwriting to me, with a note on the front, "To be opened if you ever feel forgotten." I hesitated. Then I opened it. Inside was a single page. She'd written it in 2009, the year Trevor got married. She wrote, "If you're reading this, then you've probably begun to feel like the world you helped build is no longer yours. I've seen it coming. The way they look past you. The way Trevor follows Janice like she's a compass and you're the map no one uses anymore. I want you to remember, you mattered. You taught. You loved. You held this family together longer than you should have had to. If they ever try to erase you, remind them that you were here first." I sat with that letter for a long time. Then I folded it, placed it in my wallet, and finally understood what I had to do. The next morning, I didn't get out of bed right away. I lay there staring at the ceiling. The one Elaine used to complain was boring and white and begging for skylights. I thought about how much I had ignored her back then. How many of her requests I'd written off as whimsical or impractical. How often I'd chalked her frustration up to mood or menopause or tiredness without ever really listening. I didn't want to admit it. But the idea had rooted itself. What if some of what Janice said was true? What if I had been inattentive, not just lately, but for a long time? What if Trevor had inherited that distance not from his wife, but from me? These weren't questions I enjoyed, but they lingered, heavy as rain in the joints. I made tea and sat by the window with Elaine's letter in my hand. I read it again, slower this time. Not for answers, but for tone, for that particular rhythm she had when she wrote to me without needing anything, just wanting to connect. There was something in the way she told me to remind them that felt like a gentle nudge rather than an order. She was never harsh, not even in death. The people who talk about grief like it's a wave forget that sometimes it's a fog, slow, clinging, ever-present. And some mornings, it's both. At noon, I received a call from a woman named Gretchen, who introduced herself as a family care coordinator, representing Janice and Trevor. She had a warm voice, the kind people use when trying to get elderly patients to cooperate with new prescriptions. She informed me that they had reserved a spot for me at a residential wellness community just outside Boulder, one with views of the foothills, integrated medical access, curated lifestyle programming, and a holistic approach to aging. I didn't say anything. I just listened. She went on to describe the weekly art therapy sessions, the chef-designed menus, the optional group nature walks. I pictured myself in a cardigan I didn't own, walking a circle around a man-made pond with people who called every meal an event. Gretchen asked if I'd like to come in for a tour. I said I'd think about it. 15 minutes later, I called Martin. "They've reserved a room for me," I said. He didn't need clarification. "Without your consent?" I exhaled. "Apparently they think I've given it." "Send me everything," he said. "Every document they've sent you, every brochure, every point of contact." That afternoon, I pulled out my old filing cabinet and began sorting through the neglected archives of my life. Tax returns, teaching contracts, Elaine's medical bills, insurance forms, property records. I found the original deed to our house, paid off decades ago. I found the power of attorney form Trevor had slipped under my nose a year earlier under the guise of helping with long-term care planning. It was limited, non-durable, conditional, but cleverly written. Martin would know what to make of it. I scanned it all and sent him everything. The next day, Martin called back. "There's nothing binding yet," he said, "but they're trying." "That form Trevor gave you last year? It's just enough to open conversations with institutions, not enough to move money or place you in care. But if they get any doctors to sign off on cognitive decline, it could shift fast." "They've already tried," I said. He paused. "You mean they've contacted someone?" "They had that evaluation packet mailed to me, with health notes I didn't provide." Martin's voice darkened. "We'll need to shut this down." Now, he suggested a preemptive medical evaluation, independent, comprehensive, with documented evidence of my mental clarity. He had a list of professionals who could conduct it, all of whom specialized in elder law and capacity certification. I agreed. Meanwhile, the silence from Trevor was telling. He hadn't followed up. No apology. No second invitation. No explanation for the firm's letter, or the brochure, or the whiskey. It was as if I'd been absorbed into a logistical flow chart, a task marked initiated, then left in someone else's hands to complete. I didn't recognize that version of him. Or maybe I did, and I just refused to see it. 3 days later, I had my first appointment. The doctor was a sharp-eyed neurologist with fingers like piano keys and a no-nonsense voice. She ran me through a battery of tests: spatial recall, language fluency, time orientation, abstract reasoning. At one point she asked me to draw a clock, then looked up when I placed the hands at exactly 3:47. "Why that time?" she asked. "That's when my wife died," I said. 6 years ago. Stroke. She didn't write anything down, just nodded and moved on. Over the next 2 weeks, I met with a geriatric psychiatrist and a cognitive therapist. They all asked versions of the same questions. Did I remember names? Faces? Could I follow instructions, manage money, interpret metaphors? I answered them all, some with fatigue, some with amusement, a few with sadness. But I answered, and each of them, at the end, said the same thing. You are capable, independent, and aware. Martin compiled the evaluations into a formal report, notarized and sealed. Then he mailed a copy to Trevor's home with a letter attached. Any further efforts to assume control over Mr. Mason's affairs without his consent will be regarded as harassment and dealt with accordingly. I didn't ask what kind of legal threat was implied. I just trusted him. A week passed, then 2, and then, without warning, I received a call from Trevor. His voice was different, strained, hollow. "Dad," he said, "we should talk." I said nothing. I didn't mean for things to go like this. I didn't know Janice had moved so quickly. Still, I didn't respond. She thought it was the right thing. Planning. She worries. And He trailed off. "You worry so much," I said, "that you forgot to ask me what I wanted." "I thought you were slipping," he said quietly. "You left the stove on last year. Janice said you forgot the password to your email. You keep writing checks instead of using online banking. I thought maybe—" "You thought wrong," I said. He went quiet. Then, after a long pause, "So, what now?" I looked around my living room, the same faded wallpaper Elaine had chosen, the stack of books on the coffee table, the fading orchid I still watered even though I knew it wouldn't bloom again. "Now," I said, "you stay out of my way." He tried to respond. I hung up. Later that night, I went into Elaine's closet. I pulled down the shoebox, where she kept the things she didn't want anyone else to see. Old report cards, love letters I wrote her in college, the ultrasound photo from when she was pregnant with Trevor. I added a new envelope to that box. Inside was a copy of my capacity evaluations, my living will, and a handwritten letter. To my son, it began. And then I stopped writing, not because I didn't have more to say, but because I knew he wouldn't read it anyway. The following Sunday, I woke up with a sense of strange calm, the kind of stillness that only arrives when you've already made the decision you spent weeks dreading. I brewed my tea, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the 2 envelopes in front of me, one addressed to my lawyer, the other to the Hawthorne residence. Both contained the same thing, a formal notice of revocation. The first was my decision to revoke Trevor's limited power of attorney, which had been hanging over my life like a quiet threat. The second was something far simpler, a handwritten note that read, "You no longer have access to any of my accounts, assets, or time. Please do not contact me again unless it's to apologize, with sincerity and without expectation." It was not a theatrical gesture. It was a boundary, a final one. I mailed both letters just before noon, then returned home and began packing. Not everything, just the essentials. Some clothes, my books, photographs of Elaine, the old leather-bound copy of Leaves of Grass she gave me on our 10th anniversary. I packed like a man, not running away but walking forward. I had signed a lease 2 days earlier for a small apartment on the other side of town. Nothing grand, nothing modern, but quiet and facing a lake. The landlord was a retired postal worker named Leonard, who lived downstairs and in Batham spent his afternoons carving birds from pine blocks on his porch. When I told him I didn't have a pet, he said, "You can borrow my cat if the silence gets too loud." Moving wasn't about distance, it was about disconnection, from a house filled with ghosts, and from a son who no longer saw me as anything other than a liability. By the time I finished carrying the last box to the car, I was sweating through my shirt. But I didn't feel tired. I felt clean. The house looked smaller as I stood in the driveway one last time. Elaine would have said I was being dramatic, standing there like a character in a Chekhov play. Maybe I was. But the moment deserved gravity. I didn't lock the front door out of habit. I did it with ceremony. This was the home we built. But it wasn't mine anymore. 2 days later, I received a message through Martin. Janice had contacted him, enraged about the account changes. She called it unprovoked financial retaliation. Martin told her that no explanation was required from me, and that unless she had evidence of legal wrongdoing, she should cease communication. She threatened to sue. He told her, plainly, that any suit would open the door to an examination of their behavior over the past year. She stopped responding. But it wasn't over. That Friday, I found Trevor standing at my new door. He looked thinner, not physically, but emotionally, like a man who'd been peeling away parts of himself to stay presentable. He held a paper bag in his hand. Inside was a bottle of scotch, Highland Park, the same one he'd sent me on my birthday. This time, without a ribbon. "I figured I owed you," he said. I didn't invite him in. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. He cleared his throat. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said." "I said a lot of things?" He nodded. "But mostly that I forgot to ask you what you wanted." "You were right." I said nothing. "I'm not here to justify anything," he continued. I think I got scared. Janice said you were slipping, and I didn't question it. I started seeing signs everywhere. You forgetting your keys, asking me twice about Olivia's school. I thought maybe I had to prepare for something, and then I let her take the lead. That was your choice. I know, he said quietly. I know it was. There was a long silence. He handed me the bottle. I know it doesn't fix anything. I don't expect it to. But maybe it's a start. I took the bottle but didn't open it. Starts come with actions, not gifts. I'll prove it, he said. I don't want proof, I said. I want honesty. And I want absence. For now. His face twisted in something between pain and pride. He nodded. Okay. He turned to leave. But halfway down the walkway, he paused. Do you still think about Mom? He asked. I looked up. Every day. He nodded again but didn't turn back. He got in his car and drove away. I brought the bottle inside and placed it on a shelf, not as a keepsake, as a reminder. That evening, I poured myself a small glass of Elaine's sherry instead, sat by the window and watched the sun disappear into the lake. Not everything has to return to what it was. Some things are truer when they're finally allowed to end. A month passed, then another. I settled into my new apartment with the kind of rhythm that doesn't announce itself, but becomes routine without effort. The mornings were quiet, except for the soft creak of Leonard's porch swing downstairs, and the occasional distant bark of his cat, which never let me pet her, but always sat by my door like a silent observer. I began reading again, not skimming, but really reading. Novels I'd assigned in classrooms but never fully absorbed. Collections of poetry Elaine had adored. Even a few modern essays that made me shake my head, but also made me feel something other than bitterness. I joined a small discussion group at the library. mostly retired women with sharp opinions and warm laughter, and though I didn't speak much at first, eventually I found myself offering thoughts, even jokes. They began to refer to me affectionately as Professor, and I let them, though I hadn't stood at a chalkboard in nearly a decade. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for a phone call or an invitation that would never come. I wasn't calculating how much longer I had to remain relevant in someone else's life. I was just living, and that, I discovered, was enough. I never responded to Trevor's texts after that last visit. They became infrequent, and then they stopped altogether. No messages for Father's Day, no updates about Olivia, no requests for financial help or signatures or favors disguised as concern. I didn't miss the silence. I had already spent too many years hoping for something that never arrived. The absence wasn't new. It was just finally honest. I didn't hate him. I simply accepted the truth of who he'd become, and the larger truth of what I had allowed in my own passivity. The slow erosion of connection under the weight of deference and silence. That realization hurt less than I expected. Perhaps because, in finally drawing the line, I reclaimed what little dignity I had left to lose. One afternoon in early spring, I received a letter from Olivia. The envelope was hand-addressed in pencil, the handwriting uneven, but unmistakably hers. Inside was a simple note. Grandpa, Mom, and Dad said you moved. I hope you're okay. I got the lead in the school play. It's our town. I play Emily. I think you'd like it. Love, Olivia. There was no return address, no invitation, just a child's voice, reaching through the noise of adults. I held the letter in my hands for a long time, rereading the words, wondering how much she truly knew. I didn't write back, not because I didn't want to, but because I wasn't sure it would ever reach her, and I wasn't willing to chase shadows anymore. Maybe one day she would find me. Maybe not. But I wasn't going to beg for entry into the house that used to be mine. When Elaine died, I thought the loneliness that followed was the worst grief I'd ever know. But I was wrong. The worst grief is not the loss of a loved one. It's the slow, steady erosion of how you are remembered. To be misrepresented, revised, turned into a cautionary tale by people who once looked up at you and called you Dad. But I have learned slowly that memory is not a democracy. It does not require majority vote. I remember who I was. Elaine remembered. And now I do too. Last night I poured myself a small glass of that same Highland Park Trevor had once sent me. I sat on my porch watching the lights shimmer over the lake. I thought about forgiveness, not the kind you give for others to feel better, but the kind that frees your own chest from tightening. I raised the glass and said nothing out loud. There was no one to hear it anyway. But in that silence, I felt no anger, no regret, no desperate wish for repair. Just a stillness, just peace. And in that moment, I understood something I had never dared admit. Not even to Elaine when she was alive. Some families fracture not because of one great betrayal, but because too many small ones go unanswered. The miracle isn't keeping people together. It's knowing when to let go. So I did.